For some time now, the pouring vessels I make, the jugs, have more or less been a simple straight cylinder with a pouring spout flicked into the rim. I like them, don't get me wrong, but when scaled up they lack some of the interest my other pieces have, and so in this video I'll be exploring and making a new shape. This is fresh stoneware clay from the bag, and even though it's been well sealed, the stoneware in the middle is much softer than what's on the outside, which means if I were to take a chunk of this and try to throw with it immediately, the textures of clay in the lump I'm trying to throw would be inconsistent, and I'd have a horrible time trying to throw a pot. And so, before any pieces can actually be thrown, the clay needs to be wedged up first. This is a process of rhythmically rotating and folding the stoneware in such a way that the clay is stretched into a spiral within the mass that gets ever smaller and smaller. And as it's stretched, any small voids of air will be popped and the entire piece of clay will be mixed into one homogeneous texture. The lump of clay is then slammed onto the wheelhead, it's doused in water, and then the centering process can start. Boiled down, this procedure involves manoeuvring the clay in such a way that it spins as centrally as possible on the wheel. And to do this, I usually cone it up and down a few times and then press it firmly into a thick disc. Often, when I'm centering clay, I don't watch the spinning stoneware itself to see if there are any undulations. Instead, I watch how my hands rest on the piece of clay, and by seeing how they react to the clay underneath it, I know which parts of my hands I need to squeeze harder to eliminate any wobble. I also sometimes use my index finger to scrape around the outer surface, just to make that spin more smoothly too. I then plunge in my index finger and thumb, whilst at the same time bracing the lump of clay from the outside. It's this step where beginners often introduce an undulation into their pot, and in many ways the way I push my fingers into the piece to create the well, and then open it out like this, is done with as much care as when I was centering the lump itself. I then use my index fingers to compress the base, evening it out and making sure it's level. As I'll be pulling the walls upward, before I do any lifting of the walls themselves, I'll first angle the clay in and force it up. This way the walls are facing in the direction I want them to travel, as compared to being splayed out slightly, which would be useful if I were throwing bowls, for instance. This process also thins the walls out slightly, making the subsequent pulls just a bit easier, as I'm not having to squeeze such a thick, expansive clay to lift it up. At the end of each pull, I take my hands off carefully, and I'm purposefully leaving some thickness in the rim, as this adds to the overall strength of the pot as it's thrown and shaped. And then, at the end, once I'm more or less happy with the shape, I'll thin it out properly. So, instead of making just a simple cylindrical pourer, I want to make a more angular vessel with a rim that flares out slightly, with a small bellied portion at the bottom, angled, of course. I've thrown many other pieces like it before, but they've been either vases or store jars, and have always been handleless, and I think those two protruding additions, the spout and the pulled handle, will make a huge difference to the form itself. And as always, when tackling a new shape, I'm not sure they'll work the first time round, and it will probably take me making these a number of times before I'm truly happy with them. After my first pull, I switch to using a sponge on the outside to pull up with. This way I can soak it with water, which helps to keep the walls of the pot lubricated as I lift them up. I also find it's a bit easier to make this initial indentation at the base, although in this case I think I just squeezed a bit too much, and you'll see that come back to haunt me in a few moments. And you can sort of see it in the lowest portion of the wall. There's a subtle twist, as if the wall isn't entirely even, but hopefully I'll be able to fix it. But as it stands, with the height almost there, I'll start to begin shaping the vessel properly, and in this instance that starts with a slightly bellied out bottom, which then angles back in at the waist before this top section angles out. And it's at this point you can see a thin patch make itself known around the bottom. And as I continue pulling the walls up at the top, this thin patch begins to buckle and very almost causes the entire pot to collapse. And so, to try and rectify this pot, I delicately push that bulge back in line with the walls of the pot, and then I scraped away some of the excess below. Next, very carefully, I'll push this section of the wall out against a metal kidney, trying my best to even it out if I can. Then, to make sure I can continue throwing the top half of this pot, I blast this lower section with a heat gun until it's practically leather hard. This way I don't have to worry about it buckling again as I keep shaping the top. Once the shape is roughly to my liking, I'll begin scraping clean the slip off the rest of the pot, which helps to refine the shape whilst also leaving a drier surface, which in turn will mean that the pot itself dries out more quickly when it's taken off the wheel. With most of the slip removed from the outside, I'll also use a kidney to flatten the throwing rings inside on the throat of the pot. This way, hopefully at least, the throwing rings will interfere less as the liquid passes over them as it leads up to the spout. Lastly, the rim is thrown to a finer point and softened with a chamois leather. With the wheel stationary, I place my index finger and thumb, which are dry, on the rim, and these brace the walls as my wetted index finger on my right hand shapes the pouring lip itself by gliding back and forth over the rim and gently flicking the clay out. I want the lip's edge to be sharp, so it pours better. And finally, I glide a taut wire underneath the pot, separating it from the wheel, and then with dry hands I lift the piece away. After this, at the end of the day, I'll wrap up all these pots in plastic so they dry very slowly overnight. As if they are rushed and dried quickly and potentially unevenly, the pots can warp or even lean over to one side potentially, which will make trimming them tomorrow much more difficult. In the run-up to this, I had already made these two smaller versions with pulled handles that I carved once they were leather hard, just to refine them further and to make the area where they join at the top of the pot not quite so cumbersome. Whenever I'm throwing on the wheel, at the end of the day, I'll mop all the way around my wheel to get rid of any splashes of clay and dust that's settled on the floor. I like my studio to be relatively clean and tidy, especially since Chiro spends so much time in here, often even sleeping on my foot as I'm throwing, his little head bobbing up and down as I press on the pedal. The next stage begins when these pots are fully leather hard. At this point, I can grip and hold the pots without them distorting at all. And ideally, I want them to be the same consistency from top to bottom. I don't want the base to be sopping wet whilst the top is relatively firm. And getting the pots into this perfect state can be a challenge and a skill in itself. And it's worth noting that this isn't the pot you saw me throw at the beginning. This one flares out a bit more, but it's similar, and the process of trimming it is exactly the same. I attach the pot down by brushing some slip onto the wheel head. I then place the pot on top of that and then tap center it into the middle. This slip quickly dries, and usually that's enough to hold the pot securely in place. It's a method that takes some practice, and you can very easily use far too much slip and the pot won't stick at all. It's also a relatively precarious way of trimming, as if it does come loose, there's nothing really there to stop it from tipping over other than your hands. And if I feel it coming loose, I get ready to catch it, but more often than not, it takes me by surprise. The advantage of trimming like this is that it allows me to trim the entirety of the walls without any pieces of clay getting in the way or mechanical arms like you might find on a Giffen grip. I still use those other tools for certain tasks or particular shapes, but these days this is generally how I turn my pots, at least at the beginning anyway. As for the turning itself, I trim weight away from each angle using a variety of tungsten carbide turning tools. These are incredibly sharp, but they need to be treated carefully, as tungsten carbide is really fragile, and if these were to roll onto the floor, there's a high chance the blades would shatter or chip. As you can see, trimming this top section provides me with a challenge, as I obviously can't trim where the spout protrudes from the pot. In a way, I've already thought about this at the throwing stage, and so I actually threw the rim section of the pot to be relatively thin and refined. That way it shouldn't really need any trimming. But there are some areas, especially underneath the spout, that need to be cleaned up, and so I work with the wheel spinning slowly and I move the tool when the spout comes around. Then, to clean up underneath the spout, I simply use the sharp edge of this metal kidney to scrape and smooth over any marks left by the turning tools, whilst at the same time I actually sharpen the lip of the spout by scraping away some of the mass very close to the lip. And once it's refined to my liking, I use a wetted sponge on a stick just to smooth over the area, although doing this removes the clay but not necessarily the sharper particles of sand within the clay body. So once it's been sponged, I go over this area one last time with my fingers, just to compress any sharper specks of grog back into the stoneware. With the top section of the pot trimmed, I free the vessel by sliding a sharp knife underneath it, then I clean the wheel head and flip the pot over, carefully onto its rim. And once centered, I secure the piece in place with 3 lumps of soft clay. As I won't be trimming near the rim at this stage, they won't get in the way whatsoever. I then place a nylon spinner on top and center that too, and with this tool I can apply quite considerable downward pressure, which helps the pot stay in place as it's turned. I could very well just use my fingertips to do this, but there's a ball bearing in this tool between the black and white parts, which means whilst the black part, the handle, stays stationary, the white part spins with the pot, and as my hand that's pushing down stays stationary, I'm able to push down more consistently without the rotating pot having any influence on that hand itself, which you can see here, my fingers do very slightly move with the pot as it spins. As for finishing the base, I turn a beveled edge on the outside and then I begin removing material to form a footwell. This removes any last bit of unnecessary mass in the pot, meaning it definitely won't be bottom heavy, whilst also creating quite a subtle decorative feature if anyone was ever to flip this pot upside down. As I trim, I periodically check the thickness of the base by pushing against it very gently with my thumb. If I feel like there's any give, I won't turn any further, but if it feels very solid, I know I can remove another few millimeters or so. And at last I can stamp the pot with my maker's mark, which I press in and rock very slightly from corner to corner so it leaves a clear impression. And with the pot turned and feeling very light in my hands, I can move on to the next step, which is pulling and attaching the handle. I begin with a small length of clay, which I make into a rough tapering shape before soaking it in water and pulling it vigorously to stretch the clay. My left hand holds a dry portion up high, whilst with my right hand I constantly dip it in water and then grip very tightly close to the top of the lump before moving that gripped hand down the length of clay. Every time I go back up to the top, I squeeze just that tiny bit harder, and this gradually thins the length out. To make sure it has an even cross section, as I pull, I occasionally rotate the lump of clay so that I pull both sides, which keeps the shape even. I then take this long length, lay it against the table's edge, and I snip off segments with my thumb. Each of these is a handle, and by pulling them like this, rather than extruding them, I can very quickly alter the size and shape I need, and there's no machinery to tidy up afterwards. And as I create the handle, I'll keep this smaller version in front of me, as a reference. I score a patch with a serrated kidney directly opposite where the spout is. They need to align perfectly, so it can be poured easily and visually looks correct. I then dab some slip over these scratched marks, and I pat one end of the handle blank so that it has a flared out portion of clay, and this will make it easier to join onto the jug as it provides me with material that's easy to smear into the jug's body. One hand goes inside the pot and braces the wall so that the pressure of pushing the handle blank onto the pot doesn't bow the wall inward. Once firmly pressed in place, I blend that flare of clay into the body. This creates a really strong join, which is especially useful for the next stage, whereupon the handle is pulled again, only this time I'm making it much finer, thinner and longer. But the principles remain the same, and it's worth noting that at no stage have I left these handle blanks to dry out. I work with them immediately. That way the clay remains soft and is easy to blend into the body of the jug. It's also soft enough to pull easily into shape. Although as the clay is still so soft, I try not to overwork the length of clay at this point, or use too much water, as if I do, the length of clay can lose a lot of strength, and it'll be much more difficult to achieve the shape I want without the piece of clay potentially sagging or deforming. So working quickly at this stage definitely has its benefits. Once the length is long enough, I loop it down and join it back into the body. I snip away any excess and then blend what's left neatly into the body, pushing the clay in really quite firmly, as if you don't smear the clay in hard enough at this point, it does have a tendency to crack as it dries. Once attached, I go over the blended area with a wetted finger to make the join as flush as it can be, although to some degree, as this jug will be covered in glaze, I don't have to get rid of everything, as the glaze will do that for me. And to give the handle just a bit more of an upward spring, I gently push the arc of the handle up. And with the handle attached, That's the pot more or less finished, although there's still one last step that has to be done, and that's carving the handle just a little bit to make it more refined and to make the join at the top not quite so cumbersome, but that's not something I'll do until tomorrow. Until then, I'll let this pot dry upside down. This way the wet clay of the handle will keep its nice sprung shape as it dries, as if I were to place it the other way up, there's a chance it could sag slightly, so the jug will stay like this overnight, wrapped in plastic. As the key to not having any cracks develop between the handle and the jug is to dry them very evenly and slowly. I want the handle and the jug to be the exact same consistency before I unwrap the plastic and dry them out properly. The following day, when the pulled handle is as dry as the jug, I use a small paring knife to refine the handle, removing rather a lot of clay from some places and simply thinning out others. But I try to preserve the 3 grooves in the back of the handle that you can see. It's slow, careful work, and at the end I use a sponge on a stick just to clean up the surfaces and make sure they're smooth. And here is what it looks like afterwards. It joins with a more graceful curve at the top, but the glaze will soften all of it once again, and that step, together with the reduction firing, will come in a future video, as I haven't quite got there yet. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I'll leave a few links to my social medias down below, and please subscribe if you haven't. All your support means so much and is greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time.